Empaths are deeply sensitive to how their emotions are treated. They do not expect perfection from others, but they do expect acknowledgement. When their feelings are repeatedly dismissed, ignored, or invalidated, something shifts inside them. At first, they may try to explain themselves more clearly. They may restate how something affected them, hoping for understanding. They believe that better communication will resolve the misunderstanding. But when dismissal becomes a pattern, their effort to express themselves slowly decreases. Being told that they are too sensitive, overreacting, or making things bigger than they are creates internal conflict for an empath. They know what they feel. Their body reacts before their mind even fully processes the situation. When someone denies that emotional reality, it forces them to question themselves. Over time, this repeated invalidation weakens trust, not trust in others alone, but trust in their own perception. Eventually, they stop explaining as much, not because they no longer care, but because they recognize that explaining to someone who refuses to understand becomes exhausting. They observe carefully instead of reacting immediately. They begin measuring whether the relationship allows emotional honesty or whether their feelings will be minimized again. If the pattern continues, detachment begins quietly. It does not happen through anger or dramatic confrontation. It happens through silence. The empath mentally records how safe it feels to share vulnerabilities. And when safety is consistently missing, they start protecting their inner world by sharing less and less. What many people fail to realize is that dismissal does not just hurt feelings, it damages connection. Emotional acknowledgement creates closeness. Emotional invalidation creates distance. When an empath no longer feels safe expressing themselves, the relationship loses depth. The moment they realize their emotions are not respected, their attachment weakens. They may still act polite, they may still show presence, but internally they begin withdrawing access to their emotional core. And once an empath decides that their feelings will not be honored in a relationship, their absence often follows quietly, decisively, and permanently. Trust is everything to an empath. It is the foundation that allows them to open up, invest emotionally, and feel secure in connection. When someone breaks that trust through repeated inconsistency, dishonesty, or broken promises, it creates a deep internal shift. At first, they may choose to forgive. They may give second chances because they understand mistakes happen and people grow. They believe in redemption and improvement. But when patterns repeat without genuine change, their patience begins to fade. Inconsistency is especially damaging for an empath because it creates uncertainty. One moment someone is present, affectionate, and reassuring. The next moment, they are distant, unavailable, or emotionally detached without explanation. This unpredictable behavior forces the empath into constant emotional monitoring. They start analyzing actions instead of enjoying connection. They look for signs that something is wrong because they have learned not to rely solely on words. When promises are made but not kept, it sends a subtle message that their expectations do not matter. Over time, this repeated experience teaches them that believing in commitments may lead to disappointment. They begin to adjust by lowering expectations or preparing for letdowns. That adjustment is not bitterness, it is protection. Lies or hidden truths deepen the damage even further. Empaths value transparency. Even painful honesty feels safer to them than secrecy. When they discover deception, it feels like a breach not only of trust, but of emotional respect. They may try to understand why it happened, but understanding does not automatically restore confidence. Eventually, something quiet but powerful happens inside them. They stop defending the relationship in their mind. They stop making excuses for behavior that clearly contradicts words. Trust, once broken repeatedly, becomes difficult to rebuild because their nervous system now associates that person with uncertainty. When an empath reaches this realization, they often detach slowly rather than confront aggressively. They protect their emotional stability by removing access to deeper intimacy. And without trust, connection loses its foundation, making separation almost inevitable. Empaths give naturally, they support without being asked. They listen without keeping score. They show up during difficult moments and offer emotional stability when others feel overwhelmed. Their generosity often comes from a genuine desire to care and create meaningful connection. However, when a relationship becomes one-sided, where they continuously give and receive very little in return, exhaustion slowly replaces warmth. Taking from an empath without offering reciprocity creates imbalance. At first, they may not notice it because giving feels aligned with who they are. They do not expect constant repayment for kindness. But over time, patterns become clear. If they are always the ones checking in, initiating conversations, offering reassurance, solving problems, or making sacrifices while the other person rarely invests the same effort, something inside them begins to shift. This realization does not usually lead to immediate confrontation. Instead, it leads to quiet observation. They start asking themselves whether their presence is valued or simply relied upon. Are they appreciated for who they are, or only contacted when support is needed? Are their needs acknowledged or consistently placed at the bottom? When someone consistently takes without giving back, the empath eventually feels depleted. Emotional energy is not infinite. Constantly pouring into someone who does not refill the connection creates burnout. And once exhaustion sets in, affection turns into obligation. They begin responding out of duty instead of desire. What often surprises others is that an empath does not leave abruptly in these situations. They usually give chances, they communicate concerns, they try to restore balance. But if effort remains unequal and nothing changes, their tolerance weakens. They realize that relationships cannot survive on their generosity alone. At that point, withdrawal begins. They reduce access to their time and emotional availability. They stop overextending themselves for people who show little investment. And when they finally detach, it is not because they stop caring, it is because they stop tolerating imbalance. For an empath, mutual effort is not a luxury. It is a requirement for connection to remain healthy and sustainable. An empath opens up slowly and carefully. When they share their fears, insecurities, or past wounds, it is not something they do casually. Vulnerability for them is sacred. It requires trust. It requires safety. They do not reveal their deepest emotions to everyone, only to those who have demonstrated consistency and respect. So when someone weaponizes that vulnerability during conflict or uses it as leverage, it creates a deep rupture inside them. Using an empath's openness against them can happen in subtle ways. It may show up as bringing up past mistakes during an argument to shift blame. It may appear as sarcastic comments about things they once confessed in confidence. It may even involve referencing their insecurities to gain control or win a disagreement. To the person doing it, it might seem like just words in a heated moment, but to the empath, it feels like betrayal. The reason this impact is so strong is because vulnerability represents trust. When they choose to expose their inner world, they are taking an emotional risk. If that risk is later turned into a tool against them, it breaks their sense of psychological safety. They begin to question whether sharing anything personal is wise. They start wondering what information might later be used to hurt them. After experiencing this once, an empath may forgive. They may explain why it hurt and hope it won't happen again. But if it repeats, something shifts internally. They become guarded. They stop revealing deeper layers of themselves. Their conversations become more surface level. Not because they lack depth, but because they no longer feel secure exposing it. Over time, this pattern damages connection. Trust becomes fragile because transparency no longer feels safe. The empath learns to protect their vulnerability by keeping it private. And once they decide that someone cannot be trusted with their emotional truth, they withdraw access to that part of themselves. When vulnerability is used as ammunition, the relationship loses intimacy. And without intimacy built on safety and respect, the empath eventually chooses distance over exposure. Empaths often communicate their boundaries clearly and calmly. They usually do not set limits out of anger or control, but out of self-awareness. When something feels uncomfortable, disrespectful, or emotionally draining, they try to express it with honesty. They explain what behavior affects them and what changes would make the connection healthier. Setting a boundary is not about pushing someone away. It is about protecting emotional stability while maintaining connection. However, when those boundaries are repeatedly ignored or tested, something inside the empath shifts. At first, they may respond with patience. They might restate their limits or give reminders because they believe communication can resolve misunderstandings. They assume the other person may simply need clarity. But when someone continues to cross boundaries after being clearly informed, it stops feeling like confusion and starts feeling like disregard. Ignoring boundaries sends a powerful message to an empath. It communicates that their comfort, needs, and emotional safety are not being taken seriously. Over time, this creates frustration that does not always show immediately. Instead of reacting aggressively, they often observe, they track patterns. They notice whether respect is consistent or conditional. What makes this situation particularly impactful is that empaths rarely demand extreme restrictions. Their boundaries are usually reasonable and simple: basic respect, honesty, consistency, or space when needed. So when those basic limits are dismissed, it feels intentional rather than accidental. And intentional disregard is difficult for them to tolerate. Eventually, repeated boundary violations lead to withdrawal. Not necessarily dramatic confrontation, but quiet detachment. They reduce emotional investment because they understand that continuing to tolerate crossed limits only reinforces the behavior. When someone learns that consequences follow disrespect, change becomes possible. But if nothing changes, the empath protects themselves by removing access. Walking away after boundaries are ignored is not punishment, it is self-respect. It reflects the realization that connection without mutual respect cannot sustain them. And once an empath chooses to uphold their boundaries firmly, relationships either adjust to meet those standards or naturally fade away. Emotional neglect feels subtle at first, but for an empath it is deeply noticeable. It does not always involve loud arguments or obvious harm. Instead, it shows up as silence when reassurance is needed, absence during important moments, or emotional distance even when someone is physically present. An empath senses this lack of connection quickly because they are highly attuned to shifts in emotional energy. When they feel unseen or unheard for extended periods, something inside them begins to disconnect. Being emotionally neglected in a relationship creates a slow realization that effort is not being matched. They may try to communicate their needs clearly. They may express how important emotional presence and responsiveness are to them. But if those expressions consistently lead to minimal change, they begin to understand that the relationship lacks depth or investment from the other side. What hurts most in these situations is not conflict, but indifference. An empath can handle disagreements because disagreements still involve engagement. But emotional neglect feels like being invisible while standing right next to someone. Conversations become superficial. Support becomes conditional. Attention becomes rare. Over time, they stop expecting emotional fulfillment from that person because repeated disappointment teaches them to lower expectations. This gradual withdrawal is not immediate. At first, they may try harder to create closeness. They might initiate more conversations or attempt to revive connection through patience and understanding. But when those efforts do not produce meaningful change, exhaustion replaces hope. They begin protecting themselves by emotionally stepping back. When an empath stops receiving emotional reciprocity, they internally detach before they physically leave. They reflect on whether staying in a connection that feels lonely is worth their energy. And once they recognize that emotional presence cannot be forced, they make a quiet decision. Leaving in response to emotional neglect is not about anger. It is about self-preservation. It signals that they refuse to remain in relationships where their emotional world is ignored. When an empath chooses to walk away from neglect, they reclaim their right to be seen, valued, and emotionally supported. And that choice strengthens their sense of self-worth and peace.